Hello, everybody, and welcome to Now That's Debatable. This is your host, Fantastic Facade. I am joined, as usual, with my co-host, Geocentric Skeptic. Geo, are you with me? Can you hear me?
I can. Hello, everybody.
How's it going, buddy?
I'm chilling, man.
Good to
Just
hear.
ready to tackle this subject.
Same. I am interested. I've already had some interesting topics involving this exact topic with you and a few other people that I've discussed it with personally. So, with that in mind, today's topic is going to be probably one of the most controversial that we've taken on, which is going to be, is your God a racist? And although when coming up with the topic, neither of us were thinking of a specific religion or a specific God when discussing this, I think there's going to be some obvious cases and some specific cases that we're going to do and use throughout the podcast in order to kind of express the point that there are some clear signs, if not direct statements, on racism throughout certain religions, and hosted by those religions are the gods in which those religious people worship. Would you agree?
I definitely.
All right. So
I mean,
without
the xenophobia, the irrational hatred of things that of people that are different from you. I mean, it's all there.
yeah, and I have my live chat going. You can see it up on the screen. That's me, the as the host of the show, or the one that's hosting at least today. Even though I would say that Geo and I both host the show, I'm running the software. So if you have questions or anything, it's going to pop up on the screen, as you can see. I put up if you have questions, comments, or if you'd like to call in. The number is up in the top right corner. That number is 202-888-5350. And I did a quick test call on it earlier to ensure that everything is working. I had sound coming through the device, so if you call in, you're going to be live on the air with us. And if you don't want to call in, please send a question or comment in chat. But with that in mind, I brought up some of the I brought up some of our discussion points, and of course, we're just going to do like we normally do, discuss them at our leisure. And if anyone would like to insert something that we may miss or have something specific that they would like us to talk about involving this subject that we don't spend enough time on or spend too much time on, etc., just let us know. But with that in mind, let's jump right in. Where would you like to start?
Yeah, you and I both we grew up Christian, and so and when we bring up the topic, does does religion enforce racial stereotype? So, the title of this episode is "Your God a Racist?" I mean, my mind tends to go towards Christianity. I just wanted to bring up some quotes, just straight from the source.
Okay, yeah.
So I
So
guess
obviously, both of us growing up in one of the three Abrahamic, or what are called the Abrahamic religions, being Christianity, Judaism, and Islam. So we're obviously, if you're of any of those three religions and you'd have something you'd like to contribute, let us know. But go ahead with your quotes. I'd love to see what you have to say.
sure. So let's see. So Leviticus chapter 25. And here's what it says. It says, chapter 25, verse 44. Your male and your female slaves are to come from the nations around you. From them you may buy slaves. You may also buy some of the temporary residents among you and members of their clans born into your country, and they will become your property. Can will them to your children as inherited property and can make them slaves for life. You must not rule over your fellow Israelites ruthlessly. And so that last part kind of sticks out to me. Like, you must not rule over your fellow Israelites ruthlessly. The implication is you can rule over non-Israelites ruthlessly.
Right. Yeah. I mean, obviously, the way that that's worded is that there should be at least preferential treatment to Israelites. I mean, that's a
Yeah,
pretty basic understanding of it. If you're ignoring the entire text on slavery, if you just wanted to focus on preferential treatment, it's clear that the Israelites are getting special treatment, at least according to Leviticus 25.
well, not in this particular passage. This passage is strictly about the like non-Hebrew slaves. The Hebrew slaves, they're that's handled in, I think, in Exodus chapter 21. And that's there's another stark difference right there, because that supports slavery as well. For Hebrews, for a Hebrew slave, you're after 6 years, they have to let you go.
Right.
Or
During the year of Jubilee, which was every seventh year, if I'm not mistaken.
yeah, that wouldn't count for a non-Israelite. So I mean, I, when I think of this as like from a slaveholder or a master, reading reading a text like this, I mean, this would totally justify the slave trade. Do you think? Do you disagree?
No, I mean, unfortunately, it seems at least primarily throughout the Old Testament, especially in texts like Exodus chapter 21, Leviticus chapter 25, and then there are a few others you could point to, especially in the Pentateuch, that slavery is not only allowed, but it seems condoned. It seems that there's quite obvious rules that are given to Israel on not only what you should do about slaves, but how to get more slaves and keep them for life. So, although the
Yeah.
discussion itself is specifically, is your God a racist? It seems that if we're talking about the God of the Old Testament, the God of the proposed author Moses, it seems that obviously there's an indication of yes, at least to the extent of where this God allows, condones, and or promotes in the book of Exodus and Leviticus slavery, which is like racism to its extreme.
What I would have been concerned about, I mean, if I had written that passage, I would have been. I've heard it argued that this only applied to the Israel case, and not it shouldn't be extrapolated to apply to something like the African slave trade or something like that. You know, I don't see that clear in there. This passage alone show clearly shows that the Christian God tolerates slavery. That would have included the African slave trade.
Yeah, and I think like just kind of delving a little bit deeper onto that, or kind of like pushing on that same topic, is that it seems to me that if slavery and or racism wasn't such a big proponent, and I've heard the argument from several of my Christian friends and family members that, oh, this is a different era. But it seems that an all-wise God or all-wise deity would be aware that it doesn't matter the era in which it matters whether you can hold another person as property. There should be no point in history in which that's okay. That should be, if you're building your own book of morals, at least for me, if I was building my own book of morals and I was, writing things down that I held true, owning another person would be bad in all instances, no matter the time, no matter the history, or no matter the place. It doesn't matter that, at this point you have the proposed enslavement of the Israelites in Egypt. So now that they're no longer slaves, they get to own slaves. That kind of seems like anti, like it seems
it's definitely appealed to a moral relativism. It was wrong then, but like now it's okay.
Yeah.
What really baffles me, you look over in Exodus 21, you see a verse like it says like anyone who beats their male or female slave with a rod must be punished if the slave dies as a result. But they are not to be punished if the slave recovers after a day or two, since the slave is their property. Like, I mean that.
Yeah, I mean, like
to me, that would justify like whipping.
Yeah.
Right? So
Yeah, I mean, it, you
it,
can. It even says that, if I'm not mistaken, in that near in Exodus 21, that you can pierce the slave's ear with an awl because they are your money. Like that's how you
yeah,
indicate
that
that they're yours.
mhm.
So
I'm
I mean, like this is clear physical deformation to indicate property ownership. They would do the same thing with cattle, which is why, like, you see in old cartoons, you see like a cow with a pierced ear. Well, before the idea of a modern tagging system, they would either brand by heating up metal and putting their markings on it, or pierce the ear of their cattle and their horses to indicate that was their property. So it's clear indication that they're treating that slaves and animals at the same level here.
I'm yeah, definitely. Like what's gravely concerning is that you look at this like it's not specifically mentioning race, but if you happen to be a part of a system, you have to be in a system where, due to whatever physical characteristic they identified, whether you like your a color of your skin, a shape of your eyes, or whatever, if you're part of a system where you're within a minority that is being oppressed for whatever reason, it doesn't seem like the Christian God would be on your side.
Yeah, and since we're mentioning the Christian Guide, we should just clarify for those that aren't Christian or those that don't have a huge history of religious studies or anything like that. Not saying we're undeniable experts or anything. We could potentially get things wrong, but both of us grew up in an environment in which we've studied religion, specifically Christianity, and because of our studies in Christianity, we've looked into other religions. So while we're clarifying the Abrahamic religions, Judaism basically uses most of the books of the Old Testament, if not all of them, and it's called the Tanakh, which is the Hebrew Bible. So it uses the Pentateuch or the Torah, depending on what you want to call it, which is Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy, which are two of the books that we exclusively quoted from in this specific topic already. So as far as the Abrahamic religions, covering two out of the three of them is possible by just mentioning the Old Testament. So it's the same God, whether you want to call him Yahweh or God or
Yeah,
whatever,
of course.
throughout Judaism and Christianity. So when we're talking Christianity, if we're mentioning things specifically like the Old Testament or the Torah or the Pentateuch, where that can also directly be applied to Judaism because it is the same texts.
Yeah, and did you see? Have you done any research on how Solomon built this temple?
Well, do you mean like the Temple of Solomon that was supposedly coated in
Yeah,
gold?
yeah, Solomon's temple.
Yeah, obviously that basically
So
just bringing
he
in
used
slaves from like the surrounding cities to put it together for him.
that's to me that's even seems to be even more problematic than some of the verses I just read to you. Because think about this. So you have Solomon, right? And who's the wisest man to ever live, right?
Yeah,
Remember
according to the
when
Bible, he was the
God's
wisest man.
like he God to tell him, God essentially told him that he was gonna he'll give him whatever he want, and he said he wanted wisdom to lead your people, right? And so God gives him like his divine wisdom, the wisest man in to ever live, fully endorses slavery. Not only that, he uses it to build a temple. Then God is pleased with it.
Yeah, so I
Makes
mean,
me
it
think,
just
like,
goes to
what kind of
perpetuate this
message is that
idea.
sending?
Yeah, I mean, it just goes to perpetuate the problem and the idea of slavery and the ownership of other people because it seems that if you're okay with owning other people, or if you think that like doing something like erecting a temple in God's name by using slaves is a good idea, then you're not anti-slavery. Like
I mean,
that's just
especially for instance, the passages in Leviticus 25 and Exodus 21, like you could write those guys off like, hey, Moses wasn't tearing from God or something like that. He was wrong. But in this case, you have Solomon, who's the wisest, supposedly the wisest person to ever live, who's endorsing it. No, and it's problematic to say the least.
Yeah, for sure.
And then, yeah, and then I think about passages like the civil rights movement, like after slavery, the civil rights movement, when a lot of blacks were for fighting for their rights. A lot of their protests included, peacefully breaking moral laws.
Yep.
If there's a
Such as sit-ins and
white,
stuff like that.
yeah, whites only water fountain, you go and drink from it. You do the sit-ins and all that type of stuff, right? And you would think like it's the biblical text on your side with that.
Yeah,
And
so the answer
doesn't
to me seems to be no.
same. It's something that I really struggle. I look here. It says here's a passage from 1 Peter chapter 2, verse 13. It says, "Submit yourselves for the Lord's sake to every human authority, whether to the emperor as to the supreme authority, or to governors, who are sent by him to punish those who do wrong and to commend those who do right." And then it goes on to say, slaves, in reverent fear of God, submit yourselves to your masters, not only to those who are good and considerate, but also to those who are harsh.
Yeah, so it seems to me that
And
at least in that passage, it's essentially saying that you should submit to your government even if the government is doing something that basically squashes your own rights.
yeah, and I remember I was watching this film a few years ago. I think it was 12 Years a Slave. Have you ever seen that?
Yep, I watched it just recently, actually.
Yeah, and so I think there was a scene in there. I may be mixing them up the movies, but there's a scene in there when it shows the slave master. He's reading the Bible to the slaves, and he was quoting. I think it was from this chapter.
Yeah,
And
I mean, I
a
do
lot of people,
remember specifically in the movie that they quote scripture from the Bible, and
yeah,
like I
they,
think
they were reading the Bible to the slaves. Yeah.
yeah, that kind of
So
was a big thing. They basically used the Bible to in a sense ingrain religion into slaves that were basically unknown to Christianity.
yeah, and so I hear people say that said to me pretty often, at least in some of the online groups that online discussions that I have, and they'll say that the slave owners, these masters, they were misquoting the Bible. They were abusing it. It doesn't seem that way. The problem doesn't seem to be with hermeneutics. Their exegesis is on point. This is not out of context. I mean, it is literally an endorsement of scripture. I remember when we were talking on the phone a few days ago, when we were talking about when we were going to how we're going to talk about this topic. Remember, you had brought up in the book of Philemon when Paul is addressing the slave. I think his name is Onesimus. Remember that?
Yep.
He's telling the slave to go back to his master and ask for his freedom. So I mean,
Yeah, I mean, like even in Philemon, which is I feel like that's quite literally the closest thing you get in the what typical Christians consider the Bible version, in which it kind of remotely condemns the idea of slavery. And I very, very meticulously chose the word remotely condemns because this is a very specific example of Paul speaking to a friend of his saying, you should still go and obey your slave owner, but you can ask him, as a favor to me, Paul, to be released.
Yeah, so he's not really arguing with any sort of moral authority.
No, it's
like
literally him talking on
like
behalf of a
he's-
friend.
Exactly. They're using this. He's leveraging his friendship to get a favor.
Yeah.
This isn't
Yeah, that
this isn't
doesn't condemn
anti-slavery any
slavery.
more than like the Exodus story that I hear people say that it's anti-slavery because Moses was freeing the Israelites from Pharaoh. No, that was just one. That was just one pat. That was one instance where God wanted to end slavery because He had another plan for Israel. But if you look at the passages that specifically address slavery, like I don't see one. I don't see one passage here that throughout the Bible. I even talked to my father about this. Like
Yeah.
I don't see one passage here that ever dismisses slavery. That says it's wrong.
Yeah.
He agreed. He says he doesn't. It's not there as well.
Yeah, so I
We see
mean,
eye to eye on this.
it just seems that obviously, especially in the Old Testament and the New Testament, for those who use it, for instance, your typical quote unquote Christianity. So like Judaism would just use the Old Testament, Christians would use the Old and New, but it doesn't seem that anywhere in the Old or New Testament is there the strict condemning of slave owning. And obviously, given we're talking about the topic of is your God a racist, then owning another person based off of any reason, but specifically in the case of like the Israelites, the Hebrews, and we'll get into the Islam and Muslim religion here in just a second, because I have some quotes from the Quran that I'll read. But it seems that it at best it's racism. At worst, there's obvious condoning of slavery.
Yeah, I mean, I can't say anything different. And like, here's the thing. So, the I realized the concept of race didn't didn't come about until probably about 1500 years after the Bible was put together. People were bigoted for other reasons, for like ethnicity, your nationality, etc. But
Yeah,
like
or even things like your religion, which we'll get to
yeah,
when we talk about
yeah,
Islam. That's primarily
yeah,
the reason that Islam enslaved other people because they were not Muslim.
yeah. So I mean, it's race isn't specifically mentioned because that category just had not existed at the time, which to me makes perfect sense. But all the xenophobia, all the bigotry, all the irrational hatred, it it's
Yeah.
all
So
there.
I think
And I'm just
go
I
ahead.
was gonna say that like, when I try to put myself, I mean, I try to put myself in like shoes, like as a slave shoes, thinking, oh well, you know, this religion that I'm a part of, hey, at least this Bible is on my side for supporting my freedom, and I look at it, and it just doesn't seem that way. It doesn't seem out of context. If it, it from not from a moral ground, but from a ground strictly from hermeneutics, the slave owners had much more firmer foundation.
Yeah,
In
I
my
would
opinion.
agree, at least biblically. So while we're taking it on, I think just to broaden that statement a little bit is that obviously, even though we're using the word racism here, there are obvious things that we're going to mention that aren't specific to a race because, again, like you were saying, the idea and concept of race didn't really exist until about 500 years ago. But what we mean in most of these instances, if not all of them, is that there's complete alienation of another person or people or group because of something that oftentimes they couldn't help, or more times than not, or seem almost ludicrous to hold a grudge over about. And by that we mean the color, the place in which they were born, the religion in which they currently practice or don't practice, etc. And if that bothers you, I think we should just clarify that that's what we mean when we're talking about some of the stuff. But let's dive into the Quran here, and I apologize if I pronounce any of the the initial chapter names wrong. I'll give the English translation of them, but I'm also going to try to pronounce the subsequent name in Arabic. But when talking about the three Abrahamic religions, which is kind of what we focused on with Israel, with Judaism and Christianity, since they use primarily the Old and New Testament, we also have some texts from the Quran. And when doing research specifically for this podcast, there does seem to be a few verses in the Quran which promotes releasing slaves, and there are quite a few verses in which it says the Arabic is on equal ground as the non-Arabic. However, throughout history and throughout the use of using things like Islam, the Quran, and the other books that typical Muslims use when defending their religion, you'll notice there are some really obvious passages that either are misused or at least used for the purpose of maintaining other people. So in chapter 33, it's called Surah Al-Ahzab, or the Confederates. Down in verse 50 or so, I'll give you the exact verse. It's 33:50. It says, O prophet, we have made unlawful to thee the wives whom thou hast paid their dowers, and those slaves whom thy right hand possesses, which is, according to some historical text and professors of Islam, when it uses the phrase the right hand possesses, it essentially is referring to slaves. Out of the prisoners of war whom Allah has assigned to thee. So there's clear reference that there are slaves being possessed by other people, specifically the people of the Muslim religion, and that Allah gave them slaves because they were successful in war. And this is typically how slaves kind of got started, and slavery got started, is that two clans or tribes or peoples would go to war with each other, they would take prisoners of war, and then therefore own them. And then it became whoever has more power can just take over slaves, which is where the idea and concept of the African slave trade just kind of happened. And it perpetuated slavery throughout the world because people with bigger guns would come in and just take people as slaves. And that happened literally throughout all of human history, from basically recorded history until even now. There are some examples of modern slavery.
Yeah, I haven't. Cutting you off.
You broke up there just a second, I thought.
Oh, I'm sorry. Yeah, I was gonna say, like, I haven't heard any. I mean, do Muslims do they like refute that the religion supports slavery? I mean,
yeah. So I mean, like when I was
from ISIS, I mean they're taking on a bunch of slaves, you know.
Yeah, so a lot of people who practice Islam would say that ISIS is kind of the radical extremist to that. Obviously, there are people in modernity that are practicing Islam, specifically women, that are promoting things like gender equality and anti-slave and anti-forced marriages, which are still very popular.
You know what? So when you said, like, I wasn't, like, I'm not that familiar with the way the Quran deals with racism. When you said there's a passage that says that the Arab is on par with the non-Arab.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, so you know, like they're in the 40s and 50s. There was like this huge influx, like it was huge exodus from Christianity for a lot of African Americans, and they flocked to various versions of Islam, particularly like the Nation of Islam, where you had, you know, Elijah Muhammad, Malcolm X, etc.
Mm-hmm.
And when you said that, it kind of just it makes like so much sense to me.
Yeah. As a matter of fact, there are about 4 or 5 verses that is typical when you look into racism in Islam that are quoted as like basically saying you should release your slaves. And admittedly, amongst all the Abrahamic religions, this is the only one in which I see any reference to releasing slaves. So as far as slave ownership and racism, although like it specifically mentions that there's no difference on footing of Arabs versus non-Arabs. The only difference it mentioned specifically in the Quran that I could see was on issues of piety. And by issues of piety, they mean what religion they are. So literally the slaves of Muslims and the slaves to the Islam religion that took place from about 900 to about 1450 or so, where there were almost 1 million slaves under the Islamic tradition. Those slaves had nothing to do with race. Those were all because they were not Islam.
That's what I was saying. So like it sounds like Islam seems much more conducive to egalitarian society, and that's why it would make like when I was seeing like so, and even now, I mean, how Islam is very popular, especially the Nation of Islam is very popular among African Americans, and even those who aren't Muslim have sort of this admiration, this sort of respect for it.
Yeah, and when looking into like world religions now, the reason I specifically put tribal in the discussion points under Abrahamic East Asian tribal and archaic deities is because if you just type in African religion currently, or if you type in religions of like things like the Brazilian rainforest in Brazil, which are tribal, you'll see that there's a typical trend in Africa, especially. The trend is it's primarily Islam followed by Christianity. So when you look at the two largest religions in Africa right now, it's Islam and Christianity, although tribal religions existed years, thousands of years before. And obviously things like Egyptian religions that existed for things like the worship of Horus or the sun god Ra existed quite literally thousands of years before Islam or Christianity came onto the scene. Yeah. So I mentioned them specifically, and I set them apart specifically because if you just type in religions in Africa, the biggest two are the Abrahamic religions. So
yeah,
you kind of need to separate.
It says something about human psychology that you're going to appeal to the religion as most conducive to ending your personal struggle, and I think that like you and I aren't alone. Like there's like saying there's like millions of African Americans who feel this way. It's just it didn't support them the way that they thought it would.
Yeah, I mean, you can give like the really big examples of like especially civil rights leader Malcolm X, who went from I would say like probably a deist / Christian to a worshiper of Islam and the Muslim faith because
I think his dad was a Baptist pastor or something.
Yeah, so I mean, like even if you would say he wasn't a very good Christian, quote unquote, you would still say like he moved from a Christian environment to the Islam faith, and I think primarily that happened because at least in Islam there isn't too much to say on race. It wasn't about race, it was about their religion. So as far as like racial equality goes, it seems that of the three Abrahamic religions, as vexing as sometimes Islam seems to Americans, it seems to be the most lenient, at least in forms of race.
Yeah, and I just looked it up. His dad definitely was a Baptist minister.
Yeah, so I mean, like you have a clear example of a civil rights leader going from a Christian Baptist growing up probably in the Bible Belt of America to Islam because of racial equality is more well established in Islam than it is in Baptist Christianity in America. It just kind of goes to show you that, like, especially back in the days of like Jim Crow era and post-Civil War all the way up to Jim Crow, that there was no such thing as like racial equality. It didn't exist. And to say otherwise, or to say that like the 60s in America were the quote-unquote good old days, you're clearly not looking at it from the perspective of like equality or
well, yeah, definitely. Because, I can't imagine any African American in the 60s or 70s. I can't imagine like any of my grandparents, saying, oh, the 1930s and 40s. Yeah, that was the good old days.
Yeah,
That's
it just doesn't happen. So when you
strange.
see people saying things like these were the good old days before etc. happened or before blah blah blah, you may be specifically referring to a specific instance or set of circumstances that were quote unquote good, but to refer to like the 30s up until the 60s as the good old days in America, you're clearly not talking about things like the issue of race, because for African Americans living in the United States during that time period, they were still being segregated against. In fact, I think it was 1996 before Mississippi officially ratified the anti-slavery law. So, like
Yeah,
that was in my
and to
lifetime.
me, if you refer to those times as the good old days, it says more about your character than America.
Yeah, I agree. I agree completely. So we've talked a little bit about some of what the religious texts say. There are other verses in the Quran that we could point out. I wanted to mention one more, which was in the Quran in 23:6. It's called Surah al Mu'minun, the believers, which is what that's translated as. It says, "Those who abstain from sex except those with joined marriage or bond, or the captives whom the right hand possesses." It's
Hey,
basically
wait a minute. I'm
uh,
sorry.
the,
You just baffled me. Read the whole thing again.
yeah. It says 23. I'll actually read the verse going into it. So
I'm
it
not just talking
says,
about slave rape, but go ahead.
yeah, that's exactly what it is. It says, "And those who
Ah,
guard their chastity," that's verse 5, "except from their wives or the captives and slaves, their right hand possessions, for then they are free from blame." So it's talking about the believers, and it says, "Successful indeed are the believers, those who offer their prayers with solemnity and full submissiveness." So it's talking about believers here, and what believers should do and how they should act. And it says that if you have sex with your wife, it's fine because you're married, or if you have sex with your slaves, it's fine because it's permitted. So,
interesting.
although there are clear verses, and there are typically about 4 verses that I've seen quoted on some forums involving Islam that talk about the release of slaves, there's clearly a sexual bondage in this case to slaves, that you can sleep with your slaves. It's very apparent, at least according to that. Um, and unless I'm just
That sounds
misinterpreting it,
very similar.
go ahead.
Sorry, I cut you off again. I was gonna say that sounds very similar to on Numbers 31 with the Midianites. I forget the exact verbiage. It's something like kill all the boys and every woman that slept with a man, but save
Yeah.
the virgins for yourselves.
Yep. And basically
That's what it
taking
reminds
virgin
me
women
of.
to be your own sexual slaves.
Yeah. Hmm.
Yeah, so I mean, again, like I said, when I've looked into other forums, when I've looked into some of the statements of Islam on slavery, most of the time it's not race. It's nothing to do with it. It's typically slaves are made from people who don't worship Allah. So, for again going back to the big circle of the Abrahamic religions, you have Judaism, which is the Old Testament, Christianity, which is the Old and New Testament, and then the uh, you have Islam, which is the Old Testament, aka the Tanakh or the Torah, etc., and the Quran. So you have these big three that kind
You
of
know,
all started with the same text, being the Old Testament, and all leading to their own viewpoint of slavery, ownership of other people, racism, and the deities in which these religions worship are either preponderance of or do not specifically eradicate the concept of slavery within their religion and or peoples.
that this is so deep to me because it shows the stark contrast that Islam has with the with Judaism and Christianity, and it shows to me why it's so appealing to not only um, African Americans but of any group that's oppressed in any country, because it seems like whereas Whereas in Judaism and Christianity, you the way you could be treated, you could be mistreated just because of the way you were born or something that you couldn't help. Whereas in Islam, it seems to be based on action. Now, granted, the criteria isn't a good one, whether or not you worship Allah. Right?
Yeah,
At least it seems equal. Like, hey, if I choose, if I choose to worship Allah, if I choose to do what according to the Quran is the right thing, I can reach equality. I can be seen I'm
yeah.
just as human as anyone else.
It's kind of weird to think of it this way, but I kind of look at it as like an interesting social group. So with Judaism,
Yeah.
you have to be God's chosen. With Christianity, you have to be not only God's chosen, but you also have to not be, in certain cases, from other countries, from other eras, from other times, from other religions. You couldn't have certain, beliefs or whatnot because that would make you anti-Christian or anti-Christian's God. Whereas in Islam, as long as you practice Islam, you're on the same footing as every other person that practices Islam. At least that's kind of
Yeah.
the group the group feel I get from it. And to think of it kind of like a social club is that you have, to me, in Judaism and Christianity, there are ranks within the social club. Like you can be a Christian, but if you're African American and a Christian and you live in the 1950s, you're still subhuman. Or if you live in slavery in the United States, you're still subhuman. If you're an Israelite and you practice Judaism, then you're one of the highest, best of the Judaism people there are. Whereas if you're non-Hebrew, then even though you might practice the same religion, you're definitely not on the same level as other people in our social group. So if you look at it kind of like a social group, you see not only is there hierarchy amongst, two out of the three, but you have
Yeah.
the most freedom in Islam, it seems, at least as far as racial equality. Now, when it comes to gender equality and whatnot, there's a whole different animal, and that's a whole different can of worms. We could get into things
Definitely.
like the fact that people in certain Islamic countries are still selling off their underage daughters in forced marriages because that still happens. But
I mean, that's something that can happen in the Bible as well.
yeah,
I mean, we can save that topic for another time, but
yeah,
you definitely can't sell your daughter to
yeah. And since
slavery.
we've kind of mentioned the idea of like tribal deities, archaic deities, such as those worshipped in like ancient Egypt, or even in like Norse mythology, such as like Thor and Odin and whatnot, we can also mention East Asian deities, which if you I specifically referring to like Hinduism, things like Shinto, Taoism, Confucianism, stuff like that. You don't see that nearly as much in at least their religious text, especially for things like Buddhism, who don't necessarily have a singular deity or even like a deity in general. They believe in the idea of enlightenment. You don't really see like racism epistemically in East Asian religions a lot. Now, I'm not saying it doesn't exist, but at least as far as like their religious books and their religious basics, you don't see it. Whereas in at least the three Abrahamic religions, it's a pretty clear proponent, and it's something that probably has stemmed a lot of turmoil and a lot of problems for other races throughout the world, not just the United States.
Well, you definitely. I mean, because it's so easy to appeal to it, to justify your racism or your bigotry for whatever reason. And
Yeah,
I
yeah,
think that
absolutely.
you're seeing a lot of a lot of that turn out now. Even when I was talking about how back in like the 40s and 50s, a lot of you saw this great exodus of African Americans from Christianity going towards Islam, in particular the Nation of Islam, which is like its own version of Islam, and you still see it now. I have some friends who they were Christian back when I was in college. We would go to church together sometimes, and they've given it up, and now they're follow their like African religions of various types. I got one friend. He worships what's it called, the Ghanaian god. I forget his name, but
Gotcha. But the
forget the name of
primary
this guy.
religion of Ghana.
Yeah, but that's who he worships because he wants to go back to his roots. And, it makes total sense that you're going to appeal to something that is going to support you in your struggle. And I think I don't want to jump into politics, but that's why I think why you see a lot of the black nationalist movements, like for instance the Black Panthers, sympathize with communism because of
Yeah.
the egalitarianism that is that is promotes. However, it's a bad egalitarianism, but it does promote it.
Yeah, that's
You know,
correct.
it does seem to
it's
sympathize
just
with it.
it kind of leans the direction of even though we have fundamental differences on other things, this thing that we're fighting primarily for at least is solved by this other aspect.
Yeah, yeah, and if try to put myself in their shoes, like that may be everything to me. I may not even care about anything else because my the racism that I'm facing, like it is so intrusive. It is so sovereign over my life that this is the only thing that I care about, and I might be willing to appeal to any ideology or religion to repel that racism. I mean, it makes perfect sense. I mean, I just trying to put myself, just trying to empathize and be in their shoes. You know, I, I totally get it.
Yeah. So I mean, I see we have basically someone promoting. I'm not going to read your website out. I don't mind leaving it on the screen, but it's just promoting their own following thing and promotion. But I mean, although we would like to grow our channel, we would like it to grow naturally and continue our informational and educational discussion and debate type topics. And I'm not opposed to promoting the channel and whatnot. I don't want to promote your channel.
Yeah, that was lame, bro. If you got a comment about the show, post that.
Yeah, I mean, although we appreciate the chat, we're not going to promote your channel. If you have something you'd like to contribute to the topic or the conversation, by all means, please continue to chat. But with that in mind, there are other things that we'd like to continue talking about. And part of that, at least, unless you opposed to it, is I think the reason that you and I came up with this topic and started from the beginning originally was we were talking about like the removal of Confederate statues, in the United States. And although I don't want to specifically mention the removal of statues for the purpose of what I'm going to say, I would like to bring up the fact that I want to point out something that I had a conversation with someone that I know about this topic before we started the podcast today. And we were talking about the statues, and I want to broaden the idea of statues to Confederate soldiers out to Confederate symbolism, including the Confederate flag in the United States. Because in that, you have two really important things that you should consider. The first of those things being that if the South, which seceded from the Union, was at best an act of treason when it basically seceded from the Union, basically initiating the Civil War. If you look at the letters of secession from the states that seceded from the Union, the primary, if not only reason listed on the letters of secession was slavery.
Is the only one.
Yeah, I think there's one state that mentions something other than slavery. And it was probably directly related to slavery, if I'm not mistaken. The state was South Carolina.
It was a constitutional argument for slavery.
Yeah, and I believe that one state was South Carolina. If you happen to be watching and you're from South Carolina, there was two things that you gave. One was slavery. The other was a constitutional argument for slavery. So when talking about these statues, I don't I don't know everyone's opinion on it. I don't even know how Geo feels about the statues themselves. But when I was talking to someone that had disagreeable opinion on the matter, that person and I were talking about it, and they said they didn't genuinely care, but they didn't see why they needed to be taken down. And my simple argument is that the government shouldn't be paying for things like necessarily for art anyway, but like I'm pro limited if not non-government. But beyond that, there is no reason that you can give to idolize someone that was a slaver, a slave owner, or promoted slavery. And I mean that in the quite literal sense of you're memorializing these people with a statue. And I think that goes hand in hand of A, it led us to this topic of is your God a racist? But B, some of these people are quite literally being idolized. And I don't mean necessarily that you worship them like a god, but by building a statue and erecting a statue to this person, you're memorializing and idolizing them in a physical sense. And it doesn't matter the reason that you want to give. You can claim it's heritage. You can claim it's to remember history. You can blah, blah, blah. The point is you're quite literally memorializing and idolizing in physical form by erecting a statue in their memoriam and or honor. And to me, that's atrocious.
Yeah, I mean, like, I hear people try to make the argument, you can't change history. And or removing a statue is trying to remove history or something like that, right? So I mean, statues aren't how that's not how you remember history. Like you have textbooks, you have the internet for that. Memorials is how you glorify history.
Yeah, I mean that's quite literally the concept is that you had this idea and this concept that you thought was so valid and so valuable for people to remember that you made it a public display. Yeah, if you want to look at history, there are history books. They're not on public display, although if you go to the Library of Congress, you can rent them at your leisure for no cost. And you can go to their website. You can get, there are plenty of libraries that have digital versions of history books. There are history books available for purchase. Go to your local Goodwill, buy history books. You can get them very cheaply and learn about history. If you want to learn about history, you do it through text and reading and studying the past. You don't do it by building monuments to something. Because I don't know any more history about the presidents on the face of Mount Rushmore than the fact that their faces are there.
When you think about a memorial or a monument, so when we build them, I took my daughter to the Martin Luther King memorial down at DC this past week.
It's actually scrolling on the screen, if I'm not mistaken, unless you're talking about the one.
That's the one.
Yep,
that's the one that you have on the screen.
Yep,
and we was there. Like she's one, so she didn't care. She just ran around. But I just wanted I don't want to expose it to her anyway. Because when you think about when we build a memorial for someone or a thing or whatever, what we're doing what we're saying is this represents who we are or who we aspire to be as a people, right? We have there's a Lincoln Memorial, right? Because he did something great, right? He made some mistakes in his past or whatever, right? But he did this one thing that was so great. We put a memorial for him. This is what we're about. This is what we represent. That's why we put a memorial here. When there's a memorial or a statue up for something that doesn't represent our values, it should come down.
Yeah, I mean, especially if it's on display in in a public place owned by the government. And when I say that, if you have a private statue to anything that is in your home, by all means, you can have the private statue to anything you want in your home or on your private property. But in places like public parks or public, landmarks and places like most of DC in the DC area, which is government owned and whatnot, where the Martin Luther King statue is that's actually scrolling in the background of these images. When you have things like that, the Lincoln Memorial that's up, where you go and you visit these places, these are things that are supposed to be representative of the best our country has to offer. And although Martin Luther King Jr., and although Abraham Lincoln did things in the past that people disagree with, or people may not always like have the same alignment with, they may have lifestyle choices or etc. that you would not necessarily agree with or do in your own life. Looking at the overall picture of these people, when you look at someone like Martin Luther King, who was perhaps, well, I'm not going to say perhaps, I'm going to say was the forerunner of civil rights in the United States, or someone like Abraham Lincoln, who led the country through a civil war and helped eradicate slavery, then you're looking at examples of like monumentous, and the way you quite literally have memorialized these people events in history.
Somebody asked the question: can you give an example of an acceptable memorial? Or are you saying there are none? So I wanted to jump in. I'm not. How long has that quote been up there?
34 seconds.
Okay, so because he may have chimed in. So what I had sort of said earlier is that and for me, an acceptable memorial is one that represents who we are or who we aspire to be as a people.
Yeah.
When I mean people, as the people of the United States, like Martin Luther King, we look at his values, equality, love for other people, all that type of stuff. That's something we aspire to be. We look at there's a statue of a memorial of George Washington because of the leadership that he displayed during the early days of the United States, like something like that. And the person doesn't have to be perfect, but when you think of this person, the principles, the ideology, the things that he's most known to stand for, if that corresponds to who we are and who we aspire to be, for me, that's an acceptable memorial.
Yeah, and I don't know your stance on it.
If you contradict those ideals, then no, you don't. We shouldn't have one for them.
Yeah, and I don't know your stance on it, and I'm going to go out on a limb here, and I'm going to say something like, although, like, in cases of, like, George Washington, where George Washington was a known slave owner. He was, I mean, like, it's historical fact. It's just the way it is. Some people mention that upon his deathbed, he said they should free his slaves. That's, as far as we can tell, historically inaccurate. He was, for his
he even ripped the teeth out of one of his slaves.
Yeah, to make
his own
false teeth. Yeah. So as far as we can tell, he was a slave owner from the first slave that he owned until the day he died, and he had no remorse of such. However, when you think of George Washington and when you think of what you're trying to represent here, you're saying that this person, George Washington, founded our country, and he established things like the presidency and the systematics of presidency when he stepped down after his second term, which actually eventually became a law in the United States. You think of his leadership and his wisdom that he used to steer and guide our country to basically throughout formation and throughout the Revolutionary War and its initial upbringings. The country was nothing prior to George Washington, because George Washington existed in the world before 1776. And when you think George Washington, you think insanely good military leader, first president of the United States, founding father. You don't typically just think slave owner. However, if I were to memorialize someone like Jefferson Davis, who is the leader of the Confederate Army and the president of the South during the Confederacy, I am thinking people who are fighting for slavery. There's a big difference there. If I'm memorializing for me, Southern generals,
what I want to, I'm not looking for perfection. What I look at is the principles, the things that you use your life to fight for the most. And I mean, and George Washington, I mean, despite him having slaves, I don't. It's not something that I knew that he was, at least that I know of, that he was fighting for. I mean, it's also possible, through research, we can find out that there's something that was in this person's life that maybe he doesn't represent, our ideals, and so maybe you should pull it down. Like I'm not opposed to pulling down, a memorial from anybody. If we find out more about them and find out that they don't represent what we stood for, you know.
Yeah, and I think the
So I
biggest
mean,
argument here is, and the point, the reason we brought this up is that the idea and the concept is that you're quite literally memorializing and idolizing people by erecting statues to them. And if what they're known for is a specific battle for the South in the Civil War, or fighting for the South in the Civil War, and they happen to be erected during the time of Jim Crow laws in the United States, it's probably not really a heritage thing. And if you disagree, feel free to reach out to us. But it just seems to me that they're perpetuating the idea of racism in the United States. That's what they were doing. That's what they were built for. They were representative of the white supremacy in the United States. And when they were built, primarily during the Jim Crow era, because about 800 of these statues existed, and about 90% of those were built during the Jim Crow era of the United States, it doesn't seem to be representative of history because they haven't existed since the Civil War in the 1860s. They've existed since the 1960s. You had 100 years to memorialize and idolize these statues, and yet it seems that 100 years later, during the time of black oppression in the United States, during Jim Crow law and segregation, that's when we decided we wanted to build all these statues. That doesn't really seem to be an ideal way to memorialize or idolize or bring up and save your own heritage. That kind of seems to me, at least my 2 cents, that it was to perpetuate the idea of white supremacy and racism.
yeah, man, I don't disagree with any of that.
Yeah, and then one final thing that I didn't necessarily know if I wanted to bring it up, but I will say that the other big thing, and something I grew up in the South, and so I've seen this a lot, and I see it a lot, and I hear the argument a lot, that something like the rebel flag or the Southern Cross, whatever you want to call it, the flag of the Confederate soldiers, etc. Everyone knows what I'm talking about when I say it. When originally designed, was designed by a man named William Thompson, who said, and I quote, "As a people, we're fighting to maintain the heavenly ordained supremacy of the white man over the inferior or colored race." When he designed the rebel flag, or the flag of the Southern Cross, the flag of the Confederacy, he built it with the idea of white people. He wanted strictly a white flag to point out, and obviously people recognize that as a sign of surrender, but he wanted a white flag because he thought that whites were the supreme race, and it was heavenly ordained as such. I only say that in the idea and topic hood of, is your God a racist, to remind people that throughout religion, specifically Christianity in the United States, people have used these ideas and symbols and statues and flags to perpetuate racism and to stand for racism. I'm not saying that's always the case. I'm saying there are specific instances of people doing it. And I'm saying that if you're using your religion to perpetuate racism, or if your religion holds to slavery, then maybe you should start questioning things about your religion and or deity. Because I think a really good thing that every person should do is write down some fundamental beliefs that they have and compare their religion and or potential religions and or political views and or personal views to them. So if you start with, I don't think owning other people is a good thing, aka slavery, is bad, then you should check things like the Old Testament, and perhaps Judaism or Christianity conflicts with that, as we've given clear examples of. Maybe Islam doesn't, because there are examples in which they're commanded to give their slaves to go free, let their slaves go free. However, you should do that with things other than racism, but racism as well, since obviously that's what we're talking about. So when we brought up this, the reason I wanted to dedicate a few minutes to things like the statues, the Confederate flag, and symbols and such, then that's something that obviously I wanted to go into a little bit, just because it was used to perpetuate the idea of racism in the United States. So, with that in mind, I think we should wrap up. Gio, is there anything that you wanted to add to this, or was there anything that we missed or think that we should continue on?
No, I think we tackled it hard. I'd say tune in next week, same time. Same day of the week.
Yep, we should be here 6 o'clock. Do appreciate the comments that we did get. Unfortunately, will not promote your channel. However, I do appreciate the comments that were on topic. If you have any questions or concerns, please let us know. Let us reach out to us. We have a website, our Facebook page, Twitch, YouTube, etc. Give us a comment, whatnot. Other than that, we'll see you guys next week where we're discussing a new topic, unless we get enough feedback or requests to continue and/or kind of go back and go over a few things in more depth on this topic or a topic that we've covered in the past. Also, we are open to topic suggestions, but otherwise, thank you guys so much for watching, and we'll see you next week.